Welcome to the Sustainability in Motion podcast, brought to you by ED4S. We focus on the fast-moving sustainability world to help the business community better understand the sustainability and environmental challenges we face. I'm Matt Orsagh, Chief Content Officer at ED4S.
Hi, everyone. This is Maisuradze, CEO of ED4S, and happy to be back today. I want to start with a quick quote for today's very special episode. And the quote is from Nelson Mandela. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I think we have a perfect guest today to talk about this today. And Matt, do you want to go ahead and introduce our guest?
Sure. That's a great quote to start the podcast. We may have to put that on top of every podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about sustainability training. We're talking with Terry Thornton, founder of Educate Ethos ESG. Terry, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
Before we dive in, Terry, tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got here for the folks listening.
Yeah, sure. I was born in Washington, D.C., not too far from you, Matt. And from an early age, was very committed to local impact. And for me, that meant social justice, education, and inevitably, that path is usually as a teacher. So I started off as an apprentice teacher in an underserved community, much like the underserved communities I grew up in. And what really kind of smacked me in the face, and it does for every teacher, is the inequality, right? So I'm in this school where school supplies are an issue, where child hunger is an issue, where you see families struggling, and then when you leave the building and you look down the street, you see some of the world's most powerful government agencies and wealthiest companies, right? And that disconnect became a bit of an obsession for me, right? How was it possible? What systems were at play where local communities can struggle in the same neighborhoods, the same communities, as such concentrated, wealth and power that you would see in Washington, D.C. pretty often.
Right.
So, there was no ESG term back then. So, I kind of made it up, as much like yourself and others, make it up as you kind of go along. And I was able to find a way to combine my two passions. One, teaching, and the other, this emerging thing called, ESG and, sustainability. So, for over a decade, I've been training professionals and training companies and working with companies on ESG issues, sustainability issues. And as you said, I now have my own practice, Educate Ethos ESG.
That was short and sweet. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Terry, you've been in this for over a decade now, and I know you've worked with multiple organizations. They all have different focus, priorities, approaches. So I'd love to hear from you what you have learned. How did you see this space evolve? And where do you feel these organizations are now focusing and making difference?
I think the biggest change I've seen, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, is how popular it is. Over 10 years ago, it was very much trying to convince people that it was a thing, that sustainability was real, that it had value, why you should do it. And over time, it's really changed in BlackRock's interest in it, its famous letter to shareholders, and regulatory interest rising. Now that, for me, a lot of the conversation's changing from what it is to really explaining what it isn't, and really dispelling myths. So the discussion and conversation itself is very much changing. And in terms of approaches from companies, I've been training some of the biggest financial institutions in the world for a while now. And you come up against two budgets, I like to say, for training, right? One budget, the main budget, is compliance training. And then the second budget is whatever's left over from the first bucket. So sustainability training was often whatever breadcrumbs were left over, and you make do with that for companies. Well, now, especially with the regulatory interest really ramping up, you're seeing sustainability be a part of that compliance bucket. And you're seeing it treated that way, for better or worse, in a lot of ways.
That's interesting. That kind of leads into the second question we wanted to touch on. Based on what you're seeing in the market right now and what you've seen, in the 10 years you said you've been building this, what are the main motivations to train employees on sustainability topics, and what's the business case for it? How do you show? I'm sorry, I wanted to get an acronym in there.
Oh, yeah.
For the financial folks. ROI. How do you show return on investment and track impact? Because I think that's a lot of what companies want to see. It's like, okay, yes, this is nice, but what's the return on investment for this?
Yeah. And I'm from Washington, D.C., and we have a lot of government agencies. So acronyms, I say, is my third language. So there's a lot of acronyms that I'm guilty of throwing around. And so I like the question, but I feel compelled to kind of separate it out a bit, where there's really two separate points. One being the business case, which, at this point, I think is pretty apparent. And actually, in your last podcast, when you were talking about the IBM report, you talked a lot about the business case, the profitability. And there's a plethora of content out there around, innovation, compliance improvements, cost reductions, reputation management. I mean, there's a lot of value that sustainability can bring. So that's, the case for it is robust and it's there. Whether that's the motivation for companies to do sustainability training, I think that's where there's a bit of a disconnect. Because at least this is, the caveat being, this is my experience. Right now, what I'm seeing from companies that are now entering the sustainability discussion for the first time, it's not what is the business case for, a value add. It's, how does this not hurt us? How do we not get hurt by this movement? How do we satisfy, minimum reporting standards and things like that? So that's how you get the checkbox exercise, right? Let's make sure that we just cover this topic and we're good to go, and not really diving into what sustainability can really do for your company. So when you talk about the tracking impact and the ROI, you can't get it that way, right? You get, how many people have taken the course, check, and then that's it, right? So it's a challenge to really kind of break through that and get folks to really see that it's worth checking, it's worth measuring, and this is what you get back.
Is it just, I just want to follow up quickly on that before we move on. Are you seeing things mostly still driven by compliance? And how is that curve, changing from, whatever high percentage it is, folks looking mostly at compliance, to the kind of, you talked about the IBM report we did on a recent podcast of embedding this into the company for the good of the company to make it a better company. What is the trajectory of compliance versus, embedding sustainability in the companies you work with and investors? Yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time. So I think what I like about this compliance movement, this regulatory trend, is that it's forcing folks to really at least do something, right? When they otherwise would not have. But it's a bare minimum, and bare minimum is not going to make a big impact in the world, right? So what I actually am warning clients about who look at it as a bare minimum is that eventually if you're not writing your own narrative around your sustainability practices, if you're not doing a good job explaining what you're doing, someone else will. And that is out of your hands. And I'll give you CSRD as an example, right? The European legislation that's coming out. And more companies are going to have to report on it. And any company in the world that has a presence in Europe has to report on it. So it's a big impact for the United States, for the UK. And what that legislation is saying it does is that this is not greenwashing. This is apples to apples, right? Your reporting is going to be out there for the world to see. And you have stakeholders that are just itching to get that data, right? They're going to take it and they're going to benchmark you against your competitors. They're going to see what you're reporting on versus what your competitors are reporting on. And it's going to be out there in an apples to apples way. This isn't a CSR report that, you don't really get down into, how much impact is really being made. It's very, fluffy, I would say. I mean, this is hard data driven by narratives that are going to be compared. So either you're doing a good job reporting on that. And if you don't have the data to report on that, put in the processes, get the training, get up to speed on sustainability so you can have a good report, so that you can stay ahead of what inevitably is going to happen is, companies panicking, panicking that what they're putting out there is going to be used against them. And how companies are doing the reporting, what's required is sustainability across the company. And often companies aren't kind of set up to work that way, right? Like companies often say, oh, we have to do this ESG thing, give it to compliance or give it to the CSR team or give it to that team, give it to one area in the company. And what you have is that poor sustainability person, that ESG person running around the company, hat in hand, begging for good data, right? When there's really no incentive for those folks to give you good data because they're busy with other stuff and it's low on their priorities. So you can see how bad data can really be generated and put out into this report. So that's just one example of CSRD, but increasingly there's a lot of frameworks, a lot of reporting out there, and stakeholders are increasingly having an impact on your business. And if you're not doing a good job of measuring those impacts and reporting on them, it's really going to bite you.
Thanks, Jared. That's a great explanation.
So Terry, following on that, last year we did publish the capacity building report, which we basically inspired from 40 conversations with financial institutions. The UK and Europe was not very much represented as much in the report, but I'm curious to know, based on that evolution that we talked about, like what was the sustainability training 12 years ago versus today, and talking about CSRD on this regulation, which now requires more departments to get involved. Who do you see being trained now? Is it finance? Is it accounting? Is it So you mentioned compliance, you mentioned the CSR, but what other teams are being trained today based on your experience?
Well, based on my experience, sustainability and ESG are still very much treated as, I guess, a single topic content when it's really not, right? So as a single topic content, you just give it out to everyone, right? This is E, this is S, this is G, this is SDGs, here, all the acronyms, right? Here are all the acronyms. Here are the historical events. This is what sustainability is. And what gets overlooked is the amount of effort that's required to translate that general content into something that matters for the employee, right? What gets overlooked is this question of, what does this have to do for me? So your question really drives at that, right? It's, who is being trained on sustainability? Well, it's less about the who is important, but it's what that who is getting. And what they're getting is the same thing as everyone else is getting, and that doesn't really work, right? So the IT staff has different sustainability upskilling needs than the sales staff, the accounting staff, the finance staff, right? So, for example, the IT staff, they might have to look at, what does sustainability have to do with data privacy issues, and how does that affect, how we run in this company? For the sales, what is the level of sophistication from my clients, my customers? What do they expect out of sustainability? What are they expecting us to do? What are they hearing from our competitors? In finance, what does sustainability have to do with, standard accounting practices, right? How are we measuring this? How are we looking at the finances of this? These are all very different sustainability topics, but they're all given the same training, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that flows nicely into my next question. And this is something we work and think a lot about, because when it comes to training people, a lot of the time what the sustainability leaders would say, how is this pertinent? Does my marketing person, accounting person really need to do 10, 100-hour training? Everybody has their day-to-day 40-hour job and responsibilities, and you're adding training on top of that. So we focus a lot on how can we make this really efficient and centered on the need on that specific role within an organization. So based on the experiences that you had so far, what have been some maybe like specific examples, practical examples of driving and creating and deploying this very time efficient and result oriented training for specific groups? Could you share some maybe examples or just conceptually what it could look like?
There's a stat I always point to, and it kind of drives a lot of my thinking around training, and it's that 90% of what you learn gets lost if you don't use it within 5 days. So if they're not using it, if it's not pertinent to what they're doing, it's not going to be used. And I think that stat tracks with anyone who's ever taken professional development, of course. Everyone's taken a great class, gained a great new skill, something innovative, something cool, and then just weren't able to use it. And then in their work, and then it goes away. And I think everyone practically, has had that experience at least once. And, when you look at training and what it's supposed to do, for example, give you a better way of doing something or a new skill. And it may be a better way of doing it, but it might take a long time for it to be faster and more effective than the old way of doing it. So what is that? Naturally, that runs into your priorities, right? I have to get this. I have this deadline. I have other things to do. I have to deliver on this project. And if this new way of doing something or thinking about something or adding something is delaying that, I tend to just go to the old way. And that's human nature, right? That's perfectly natural for someone to do that when the incentives are there to do that. So that new way doesn't really get integrated, right? And I think sustainability training can fall into that trap, right? It's here's this great content. This will help you in the work. It helps the company. It helps the world. But if it takes the user a lot of mental power to try and figure out how or when to use it, they're just not going to do it when they have their other KPIs to deliver on. So that 90% number, it's shocking, but I think people really relate to it because I think it really tracks with everyone's experience.
Yeah, you touched on a point about KPIs as well. And I think that's also a key because education and training itself obviously will not and will not make the change in behavior we need to see. So, that incentive system, those KPIs, those specific goals, until they're really integrated into those roles, I don't think we can see much change happening. And that comes down to the return on investment, the ROI that Matt Earl, right?
Exactly.
How do you measure it, right? Like, is it really attributed to the training? Mm-hmm. It's a whole kind of a set of tools that need to be used, right? To make that transformation happen.
Yeah. And I would, and I see this a lot with my clients as well. I would, particularly for sustainability leaders in terms of tools, because I want to pick on that word you said, there's a bit of fatigue when it comes to new tools and new platforms. And when you have something that can drive change, that's another barrier that can really halt that progress you're trying to make. Here's another tool, another sign-in, another platform, or in terms of communication, email fatigue. Here's another newsletter. Here's another, so there's a lot of fatigue that just gets drowned out in, white noise. Again, while you're just trying to do what you're trying to do to get through the day. So what I advocate for is just use what you have. You already have performance evaluation tools, right? You already have these things. Integrate sustainability into it. You already have training, right? Just add sustainability training into that side by side. Onboarding, right? Pretty much every company has an onboarding program. Make sustainability a part of that onboarding program, right? So, and in training in particular, and I'll give this as an example, I've seen firsthand a company that really wanted to add a robust training center, right? This is a Fortune 500 company, and they added 12,000 new courses from a library they bought and dumped it in their learning management system and said, here. Right. And you can imagine how well that would go. Right. If I want a sip of water, I'm getting a fire hose. Like how am I supposed to sort through this? How am I supposed to figure out what I need to learn? And particularly, if you add sustainability for that company, if you're adding sustainability training, it's 12,001 course. Right. So it's really integrating into what you already do and using the tools you already have instead of adding new platforms, and which is a challenge because those new tools can do so much. And the old tools, they're a bit limiting, in a way. So there's a balance there. But in terms of really getting started and really integrating sustainability, upskilling through the company, I think you really have to be kind of inventive in the tools you already use.
Yeah, I want to throw in one of the tools that one of our potential clients is using, which I think is actually really great and addresses that problem with flood of information and tools. So what they do once a month, they dedicate a Friday afternoon for entire workforce to do training. So you're taking your Friday afternoon and you need to be doing training. And one of those Fridays in a month is dedicated on sustainability training. They can pick a topic. So it could be climate, water, social justice, whatever it is, but it's a time that's set aside just for that. And I think that's also that part of the toolkit that sustainability leaders could use. Obviously, you need the buy-in from the top because, that time is not being used elsewhere. But again, the sustainability training is a long-term and it's a journey, right? Just as sustainability work in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Terry.
No, exactly. And, and I use this example a lot. When an employee comes to work, they have what's in front of them, right? What's in front of them is the work they're doing, the KPIs they're delivering on, the projects, and the tools to accomplish those. Email, Slack, all of that. That's right in front of them. Training often is outside that space, right? So that mental space you're in, training does not reside within it. And the tools that, traditional tools we often employ, learning management systems, things like that, I love them. They scale out, they're great platforms, but at the same time, they kind of reinforce that separation, right? I'm leaving my work to go to the course over there. Even if it is just digitally, it's still a separate space that you only go to for training, right? The training is not a part of what you're doing, and you're not learning as you go. So that is a challenge when it comes to that retention I'm talking about, right? That 90% number, when you're leaving what you're doing, it's kind of counterintuitive. Like I'm trying to improve what I'm doing. And in order to do that, I have to leave it behind, go get it, and try and bring it back. and that bringing it back, again, gets into that translation problem. It gets into that comfort level and the speed and efficiency you can use it and that sort of thing.
Well, I think we've made a good argument for embedding sustainability training into more of what companies do. But before we wrap things up, and I think we've gone through a lot of great stuff on lessons that sustainability leaders can learn about upskilling employees. Before we go, is there anything else you wanted to touch on? Any other lessons you wanted to make sure sustainability leaders know and learn, and helping to train folks so they can embed this into what they do?
Yeah, I think one thing, it almost seems like you can't have a conversation about training without Gen AI popping up. So I got to institute that new rule, I guess. I think learner expectations are increasingly becoming more on demand, right? Answers on demand, new skills on demand. And that's been accelerated by, Gen AI, right? You're able to get this information on demand and in training. And this is, if someone asks me, what keeps me up at night about training, it's that in training, we have this traditional, adage of general training is scalable, cheaper, and quicker to produce, right? You get it out to more people. It's general versus customized and targeted, which is more expensive, harder to do, and takes longer, right? And you pick, there are areas in between, but in general, those are kind of the two approaches. And we're getting to a point in some point in the future where customers are going to say, we're going to demand tailor customized content, for my situation on demand at the price of generalized content. And that is something traditional tools, our current tools, we're not quite there yet. And I think for sustainability, especially for sustainability, it's changing every day. Like last week, a new acronym for you, CS3D for the audience, if you haven't heard about it yet, is another one in Europe that's come up, a regulatory change. There are new regulatory changes happening constantly. The language is changing constantly. And the learner expectations are becoming increasingly more on demand. So how we have to kind of rethink the technology we use, how we deliver on content to kind of meet that new expectation to keep people up to date and upskilled.
That's a great vision to kind of project ourselves in the future and see what sustainability education will look like, and just any corporate education, right? You nailed it with Gen AI. I think
exactly.
As you can ask today, for me as a educator, as an employee in a specific role, what do I need to know on specific topic? I think today this is more and more accessible. So that really puts us educators and education providers in a position of how do we fit into this quickly evolving journey, and how can we help companies still advance, because obviously there's a lot of noise out there, and the information that's been fed into the machine is not exactly all that vetted the way the experts do. But yeah, that's a good projection going forward. Are there any other evolutions you see other than Gen AI that will come and reinforce sustainability training?
I think I think one last, I guess, parting thought might be to. It seems obvious, but when you work with clients, you don't see it as that obvious. It's to be more proactive than reactive, right? This is coming. Your sustainability practices are going to be on display, and will you be ready for it, or won't you be ready for it? And it's rapidly being driven by not just regulatory agencies, but your traditional stakeholders. Your relationship as a company to traditional stakeholders is changing too. It's not just external stakeholders. It's not just community groups. Employees, it's not just about what the salary is and what the benefit is, right? It's about what you're doing as a company. Are you the good guys or bad guys? Or, what are you doing around, ESG sustainability that starts to matter with employees. Investors are now looking at that as sources of data to make their investment decisions on, right? It's no longer about traditional, investment KPIs. Now you have new sustainability KPIs. So the relationship with these traditional stakeholders that have always been there, that's changing too in this new era. So lots of change and lots of work to keep up with that change.
Thanks, Terry. That was great. That was great stuff. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you for all our listeners for listening to the podcast. Feel free to reach out to myself, Maria, and Terry on social media if you want to learn more about these things. If you'd like to learn more about what we're doing at ED4S, you can find us at ed4s.org. Take care.